Act 1 was a strong start to Arcane's second season, in my opinion. In particular, I'm very glad that it just immediately went right into it. Just about every other series out there would have had a flashback between Caitlyn and her mum or something first, but we immediately get thrown into the aftermath of Jinx's rocket. And it's immediately so much more engaging as a result. The wild chaos and death. It's a great opening sequence that immediately got me excited for this series again. And man, the art is so beautiful. Caitlyn's world being colorless and grey following her grief, except of course Vi and the violets. And apparently this was hand-drawn in charcoal, by the way, which is absolutely insane. And in particular, Season 2 seemed to make the already good facial expressions even better, down to that heartbreaking little inch forward Caitlyn takes as the casket closes, just to see a fraction of a second more of her mum. The way we see her struggling to hide the grief that keeps bubbling up to the surface. And Caitlyn is the absolute star of Act 1 for me. We see all the different thoughts she has going on through her head. Her regret at not taking the shot when she talks to her dad, the slight difficulty she has in confessing that, showing almost guilt on her part for not taking it. And of course, a swift and very efficient reminder that this has only made the divide between the two cities even worse. As her dad asks, why is Vi still there? Clearly filled with anger towards her for simply being from Zaun. Which, he's clearly grieving and taking his anger out on her, but so is Caitlyn. And as I'll come back to in a bit, she initially doesn't fall down that hole of anger, right? For now, she just hides that grief away from everyone except Vi. And my favorite part about Arcane is how you can tell that the writers really thought about what's going on in each of the characters' heads. There are a couple parts in later acts where I do kind of disagree a bit with them, but for now you can see why Caitlyn thought offering a badge to Vi made sense. Obviously it's been a while since the attack and Vi is still here in Piltover. It'd be much safer for her to wear one, both for acceptance from other Piltovians and so that she doesn't have to go after Jinx alone. But it also makes sense that Vi would be repulsed by the idea of it, and that Caitlyn would underestimate how much so. I think there's also that first glimpse into the darker side of Caitlyn that's currently dormant, with her line about how I thought you were on our side. So by the end of Season 1, she seemed a lot more understanding about Zaun's situation than most people, even challenging her mum on it. But now there's this clear distinction in her head of us and them that we saw from her in the first half of Season 1. And of course, as we later find out, there's a part of her mentally wrestling with where she thinks Vi stands in that. There's so much packed into one little scene, and no doubt, all of you probably thought something quite different to me whilst watching it. And that's the real beauty of the show, and how layered and deep so many of these characters are. However, the scene following this shows my biggest or really only issue with this season. We're then introduced to a character who seemed to be set up for so much more than he got. Why did they hide his face here for 20 seconds? What was that about? I think, as we'll come back to later, the writers had a lot more they wanted to do, but sadly couldn't due to how expensive the series was to make. But you probably don't even know that this guy is called Loris. I don't even know how I know that. Yet they give him these tiny little shots, like him pretending to be asleep whilst listening to Vi's conversation, or leaving at the end of the act, or later on Vi mistaking him for Vander. Something was clearly being set up here, but they just couldn't fit it in along with everything else. And whilst not at all the writer's fault, it's a real shame. But anyway, obviously very minor complaint. And then of course we have Maddie. And looking back at the scene after knowing what happens later on, never mind the fact that her accent is completely out of place, but also the bit she says about how Caitlyn said that if every enforcer had a heart like Vi's, Piltover could take on Noxus itself. She must have been smirking to herself behind that innocent smile. And there's also the other guy whose name I honestly don't know, but I don't think he has a single line of dialogue in the entire series, So yeah, returning to Caitlyn, the next scene really made me love her as a character. Her conversation with Jace and how, despite her hatred and anger towards Jinx, she says that, "I understand how easy it is to hate them now. One vicious act." And when she talks about the three faces that she sees, her mother and her grief towards that, Jinx and her anger towards her, and then Vi, who she doesn't explain her feelings for, either not wanting to admit them to Jace or not being certain on them herself just yet. She definitely has romantic feelings at this stage, given that we see them kiss next episode, but as we mentioned earlier, we see later on that in spite of that kiss, there's still some doubts in her mind, you know? The one thing she is certain of is that she's against Hex Tech. At this point anyway, that Hex Tech won't save them. And Bessa, of course, wants to change that. And so leading into the memorial attack, it did kind of bug me that this guy was just allowed to walk onto the stage without these other enforcers even questioning what was happening, or that Vi was the only one who seemed to notice his tattoo. But I can see how you wouldn't really suspect someone wearing the same uniform as you to be doing anything, but anyway. The timing was brilliant on this because I was just wondering before the scene when we were going to find out what Zaun thought of the attack and how they responded to it. But it's a very clear message to Piltover. Your regular weapons don't work now against the level of technology Zaun has. You need Hex Tech. Obviously, Ambessa's exact intentions with this attack, which is why we later find out that she held her response until Hex Tech was used. Also, the way Maddie was just picked out of the carriage and thrown around a bit without killing her is pretty funny looking back. But obviously, on a less funny note, is Caitlyn's descent into anger, now calling the Zaunites animals and clearly starting to question the peaceful option. This second attack seems to have just eliminated any sort of reservations she had in her anger towards Zaun, like the floodgates have just been completely opened. And obviously, raising a lot of very interesting questions at the time. Is she going to turn against Vi? How unhinged is she going to get? Will there be even more attacks that push her further? And I think not showing Zaun's side of things really made this hit even harder, as we have no idea what's brewing in the background that could make the situation even worse. Obviously, we end on her telling a counselor to shut up and address her with respect at the end of the episode. And she's always kind of challenged those above her, so this feels in line with her character, but she's now doing it in a far more direct, aggressive way as opposed to sneaking around like she did in season 1. And also, now wielding Hex Tech weapons, which she previously stood against. Her line about one violent act earlier now seems to be holding true. It's all very different to the Caitlyn we know, and it worked fantastically for me. You know, I thought this was a great episode to kick things off. You know, continuing on a lot of plot lines from season 1, setting them up very nicely for more this season, and my favourite one is undoubtedly Jace's. Without a single word from him, we see him weighing up his decision to start building Hex Tech weapons, something that Caitlyn no doubt pressured him into doing. We know exactly the conflict that's going on in his head, his promise to Victor against everything Caitlyn is telling him. But it does kind of make me question that, given Ambessa was behind the attack, why did she specifically hire someone with a grudge against Jace? Sure, him being out of picture would be extremely useful for her, as Jace is kind of standing in the way of Hex Tech weapons being developed, but he's also seemingly the only one who actually knows how to do it, given Victor's condition. So if he dies, she'd presumably struggle to get more built, and we do see exactly that later on. She doesn't intervene when he's about to die, even though she could have. So she evidently saw no issue with him dying. And I think that all simply comes down to her underestimating just how difficult building Hex Tech actually is. But anyway, I really enjoyed this episode. I love the way they focused on Piltover. In this, obviously we saw the response of a few Zaunites, but as I said, the delaying seeing everyone else worked really well for me. You know, with Caitlyn's growing anger, we have no idea what's brewing to push her over the edge. But it's actually quite the opposite. We start with Jinx saying goodbye to Silco. And this felt to me like the first time we've seen Caitlyn really mourn someone's death. I know that sounds weird, but in episode 1, she seems to be more upset that Vi is upset. You know, I think she's maybe too young to really understand what's happening, but she only ever really looks at Vi in this scene. Likewise, in episode 3, her anger isn't at anyone's death, but at Vi for leaving her. She doesn't even mention anyone else, it's just, why did you leave me? That's a real simplification, I know. And obviously, she is sad at their deaths and no doubt mourned them quite a lot off screen. But to see her on screen outright, no kind of ambiguity, just outright mourning someone like this, felt pretty new. And that little lunge of her hand where she struggles to really let him go is not only obviously very similar to Caitlyn, but something we see a lot of Jinx in Act 2, but that's for a separate video. For now, I really enjoyed the scene of the Chem Barons squabbling over their internal disputes, and Savika's attempt to unify them. It's a great reminder of just how impressive Silco really was to have come anywhere close to unifying them at all. But it's the conversation between Jace and Victor that's the real highlight for me. It's fast, heartbreaking, and sets up so many questions. Victor is angry at Jace for not destroying the Hex Core, despite it saving his life. Previously, he told Jace to destroy it for him, because he couldn't bring himself to do it. He knew it had the potential to save him from his illness, but he didn't want that anymore. But Jace, in classic Jace fashion, is just trying to do the right thing, but unfortunately, finds his methods backfiring. He's a good guy, you know, he really is, and he tells Victor very honestly that he knows that his place is in the lab beside him, finding ways to use Hextech for good. But what he says and what he feels doesn't align with his actions. Victor can see the Hextech plans in front of him, and the blueprints for a Hextech gun have just one explanation. Jace is building Hextech weapons again. And what makes it so sad for me is that Jace completely means it when he says that he never asked for this. He never asked for the responsibility of looking after the city, of having to make these impossible decisions. It was Heimerdinger who first pushed him to give the Progress Day speech, then Mel, who pushed him into the role of a counselor, and then the Undercity's attack, and Caitlyn pushing him to weigh up that promise with the safety of Piltover. He never wanted any of that, and as we saw in his conversation with Mel earlier, he didn't want to make those Hextech weapons, but circumstances effectively forced him to. His words and actions differ, but the rift growing between him and Victor had really been growing ever since their disagreement on how to respond to Jinx's attack on the bridge last season, and maybe even earlier than that. But this was the final straw for Victor, who knows he has to walk away. And I think he knew from his experience with the Hex Core that the longer he stuck around, the harder it was to make the call to get rid of it. I imagine he felt the same thing here, you know? But anyway, interestingly, given Victor's theme of isolation, especially later on, Jace isn't left on his own for very long. In fact, I think we only ever see him on his own when he's in the Forge. But Echo and Heimerdinger break in, with this quite funny little awkward rivalry as Heimerdinger introduces them to each other as former and current pupil. And also the pair don't know it, but they did actually meet before a long time ago when Jace went to the Underground to buy the gear from the shop Echo worked at, and Echo charged him double price, which is hilarious looking back, but anyway. Echo definitely knows who Jace is now, and I think there's this silent mix of anger at Jace the Counselor and admiration at Jace the Inventor, you know. But I think it says a lot about Arcane that they can just make a great scene by throwing two characters we've not seen in a room together to just talk. You know, it just always ends brilliantly. But the two don't say a word to each other before we cut back over to Jinx, who's currently taken apart that old punching machine from season 1 that caused her so much rage when she couldn't beat Vi's high score, before being interrupted by Vi and Caitlyn using chemical weapons, with Vi resembling the Enforcers in the very first scene of the series, which killed her parents. And it's heartbreaking seeing the reaction this causes Jinx, as she runs away crying and screaming. And for pretty much the first time in the entire series, I think, she gets caught out by someone. Usually she's completely elusive and untouchable, but evidently she can't get her thoughts straight right now. And something I noticed, but admittedly can't quite put my finger on the significance of, and I also don't think I can show it because it might be a little risky for demonetization, but the way he puts his needle finger in her eye seems awfully similar to the way that Jinx used to do Silco's shimmer. But again, I really can't figure out what the significance here is, so maybe that's just me looking into things too much. But the fight that follows is so ridiculous, I must admit, on my first watch, I didn't really know what to make of it, but when I rewatched it, I just loved it. It's just really fun to watch. And I love how Jinx handcrafted this arm for Sevika and wrapped it up in a bow. I really think she put a lot of thought into it, as she doesn't really have anyone or anything else at this point. The two don't get on, but they have spent a lot of time together, and I think there is an unspoken respect between them. Although Jinx would never admit that, hence the login theme on her speakers, which did make me chuckle a bit. But the contrast between Sevika's seriousness and Jinx's complete jokiness just works so well. Although, whilst I do get that the whole gambling arm thing is because Jinx has seen how much Sevika loves gambling, why on earth would she put in a result that just seems to disable the arm a bit? Also, it's kind of a shame that we never found out what the jackpot actually does. I was kind of looking forward to that. And I do think Sevika didn't really get the screen time that she should have later on, but I'll come back to that in my Act 3 video. But it's the final scene of the episode that's really interesting, with Huck and a very new Victor. And Huck clearly does not want to hurt him at all, but he's just so desperate. And we seem to see the very worst part of Zaun here in terms of poverty. As Vi mentioned to Caitlyn last time they were here, it's a place that Topside doesn't want to think about. But Victor, of course, grew up around this kind of suffering and has only ever wanted to fix it. Only now, he actually has the ability to. And obviously at this point in time, it seems brilliant. It doesn't seem like there's a cost to it, just the Arcane doing wonders. But thinking about it looking back now, he seems to have cured their shimmer addiction, which is obviously partly physical, but also partly mental. He's doing something to their minds too, although we don't know that just yet. And of course, as we always do in Act 1, we end with Singed working on something evil. We just know that this thing is going to be unleashed on the others at some point. But the thing is, we end on this mad evil chemist and immediately start the next episode with Caitlyn using chemical weapons, using the same ventilation system that her mother put in place to allow the Undercity citizens to be able to breathe, becoming the monster her mother described the gases as. And what makes it even worse, rewatching this, is that you can see her flicking through these pages, showing diagrams of internal organs, which can only really be talking about the effects these gases have on people, and yet she does it anyway. In fact, these gases are probably worse, but she just doesn't care. Well, okay, she probably does care as such a little bit, but evidently not enough to not do it. I imagine Vi felt a lot more conflicted about it, but we never really see that. We do later get the conversation between her and Kate where she says that Jinx has taken Powder's place, etc., and that it just has to end. But what Vi says about how everyone in my life has changed, promise me that you won't too, never really hit me until now. But now that she's accepted Powder's gone, she really has lost everyone. It was only super recently that she even got out of that jail cell that she spent a significant portion of her life in. And she's never really had a chance to process everything that's happened unless you count the time in there. And so I think that even if she didn't have the romantic feeling she has for Caitlyn, she'd still see her as a hugely important part of her life, despite the fact that the two really haven't known each other long at all. But anyway, the pair finally kiss, and then we return to what ended up being my least favorite plotline in the entire series. It seemed so cool at the time. I had so much faith that they could handle all these different plot lines, and I think they did, except this one. I'm not a huge fan of the Black Rose plot. I certainly don't hate it, and I get that they've left it relatively unsolved so that they can continue it in Noxus, but I think the parts they left unsolved were pretty unsatisfying. This whole thing pretty much just became, yeah, your mum's a bit of a snake, Mel, and you're actually a mage. Do you want to join us? And it's a shame because it was the most exciting plotline for me at the time, and this constant ticking time bomb in the background of the series that basically just ended up being a reason for Ambessa to be in Piltover and a reason for Mel to be a mage. Maybe it makes more sense if you know a lot of the Black Rose lore. I used to play League, so I know about like LeBlanc, but that's kind of it. But you shouldn't need that for the plot to work, you know? But yeah, a minor complaint in the grand scheme of things, but still. The following scene with Echo and Jace, however, is great. Again, as I said, they can just pick two characters, have them talk, and the dynamics are always great. But it's another item on the list of things where Jace has genuinely tried to do good and is backfired, with his Hextech now harming the same Zornites he wanted it to help due to it poisoning Echo's tree. And personally, I think it's really cool how we spend a lot of the series learning about the Arcane at the exact same rate as the characters themselves. I always felt like that really added to the danger of it. But anyway, we round off the act with two of my favorite scenes in anything. Firstly, the intertwined fight with Caitlyn and Vi against Savika and Jinx, which just looks phenomenal. The music is phenomenal. The way it transitions over to Jace, Echo, and Heimerdinger is phenomenal. The whole thing is just perfect. But before we get into the other scene I adored, we do obviously have quite a lot to talk about Vi and Jinx. Kate shoots her middle finger, something I'll come back to in my Act 5 video. But despite Vi's early resolve to tell Caitlyn to take the shot if she gets the chance, she crumbles for a moment when she sees Jinx's bloodied, miserable face, the same way Echo did in episode 7 of last season. However, unlike Echo, she actually still goes for it regardless, until Isha, who we'll speak a lot about in the next video, gets in the way. And I love the way she looks at Vi, the same way Vi used to look at Enforcers. Both her and Caitlyn have become what they hated for the sake of taking down Jinx, and Jace too, of course. And I've seen a lot of people say that Vi was just using her as an excuse to stop Caitlyn from shooting Jinx, and I do think part of her was definitely relieved to have a reason not to shoot her, but she did still swing her fist at Jinx there, and that definitely would have been fatal given she has her gauntlets on. And all of this is a brilliant bit of insight into Vi's mind for me. This was such a hard decision for her, with the slightest thing able to convince her either way. Despite what she said to Caitlyn about if you get a shot, take it, she was right on the fence about her decision. It kind of reminds me of what Victor said to Jace about the Hex Core last season, asking him to destroy it because he knows it needs to be done, but he just can't bring himself to do it. And it's not just her that's walking this kind of fine decision line either. It's Caitlyn too. She's also been on this tipping point where one incident could set her off the rails or bring her back to normality, and Jinx's attack on Piltover is obviously the former. She lets out all these awful thoughts that she must have had for a while, you know, basically telling Vi that she's the same as the rest of them in a very negative way, before hitting Vi with her rifle and leaving her behind. And you can see the slight regret and shock on her face afterwards, but it's not enough to even make her apologize, let alone stay. And it kind of annoys me that we never get an apology from her, but anyway, a lot of this really reminds me of when Vi left Jinx at the end of season 1's first act. The physical abuse, the awful line out of anger with a look of regret and shock afterwards. Except Vi doesn't have anyone to comfort her like Jinx did with Silco. Vi is now just utterly alone. And obviously, there's a lot to say about that in the next video, but now we have the final scene of Act 1, and it is one that has played over and over in my head when the act came out. This was one of my favorite scenes ever. I do feel slightly let down by how they continued it into Act 2, but I still think it's absolutely top tier on its own. The attack on Piltover has its citizens scared, and obviously a nation of inventors isn't used to combat and war, but Noxus is. And Ambessa is smart, man. You know, pointing out all the wrongs that Zaun, or really just Jinx, has done, and none of the injustices that Piltover has carried out towards them, playing on their fear and their disdain towards the Undercity. Also, as a reminder, in season 1 we found out that Mel was the richest person in Piltover and the poorest Medara. We know how much these rich Piltovians love their status, and Ambessa is full to the brim of it. It looks like she planned to have Silo take the role initially, but he said himself in episode 2 that he's lost it all, whereas Caitlyn's named the Witches people, and Ambessa saw exactly that when she overpowered a room of counselors in episode 1. And so, Ambessa calls her forward, and fucking Maddie being the first one to do the salute. I hate you so much, but I love the way that we see Caitlyn's doubts. Also, Ambessa hitting her with the come child, wanting to make it very clear to Caitlyn that she's the one actually in charge here. And so, Caitlyn takes a long look at the city before turning her back on it, as she hands herself, and thereby the city, over to Ambessa. Obviously, she doesn't know that she's turning her back on the city, and we conclude with this incredible shot of her giving them all the Noxian salute. And of course, we have that little 30-second clip of Singe at the very end, which makes it very clear that he's either finished with whatever this is, or very nearly there. And so yeah, episode 3 was one of the season's strongest episodes for me. You know, so much done so well, so many fantastic scenes. I actually feel like I have a lot more to say about Acts 2 and 3 than Act 1, so if you enjoyed this video, you'll definitely enjoy those even more. If you didn't enjoy the video, maybe give me a second chance in those videos, because I do think I have a lot more to say on those. Either way, hope you have a great day.